That stuff that gets included in GDP that really shouldn't be there, that's not reflecting actual material prosperity. And on the other hand, tons of stuff that happens in your life and mine that does reflect genuine material prosperity or sort of increasing even material welfare is not captured by GDP. If it doesn't enter into a taxable financial transaction, yeah, if you bake a pie for your neighbor, and you take that over, that probably increases the neighbor's welfare in all kinds of important ways, but it's not registered. It is an extremely coarse measure, even of material prosperity, and this is, I think, is something that's easy to overlook.
Welcome to Inside Policy Talks, the podcast of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. I'm Peter Copeland, Deputy Director of Domestic Policy here at MLI. We often measure success in our societies by what's easiest to count: income, output, and growth. But what if we're missing the bigger picture of what it actually means to live well? Across the developed world, we see a similar, and I would say troubling pattern. Material prosperity has undoubtedly risen, along with opportunity and indicators of well-being. But especially for younger generations, they are starting to stagnate or decline. The latest report from the UN's Happiness Survey suggests pronounced declines, particularly in Anglosphere countries. That includes Canada, the United States, UK, Australia, and New Zealand, which continued its decade-long slide in the happiness rankings, dropping to 25th spot on the most recent survey. It's Canada, that is, and the United States sits at 23rd. So it prompts us to ask the question, are we measuring the right things? New reports like Harvard's Global Flourishing Study are raising fresh questions about how we measure a good life. And this is an issue I've been thinking about a lot in my work, especially when it comes to how public policy shapes not just economic outcomes, but the deeper conditions for human flourishing, things like family life, community purpose, and meaning. And I think, our methods of measurement and policy frameworks often treat people as just a collection of variables in snapshots of time, rather than as persons who develop capacities and relationships over the course of a life. And my guest today is Brendan Case, Associate Director for Research at Harvard's Human Flourishing Program. He's been closely involved in the Global Flourishing Study, a major international effort to better understand well-being across countries, cultures, and life stages, and to move beyond a narrow economic or purely subjective measures of happiness. So before we begin, please remember to like and subscribe. Really helps us reach more people with these ideas. And Brendan, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. Thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
Yeah, and it's very fortuitous timing, although the results maybe not so much. Release of the UN's latest World Happiness Report for our conversation. It gives us a widely cited snapshot of global well-being, but as I alluded to, when you look more closely, especially at the latest figures, you see some pretty interesting declines, across countries, but particularly in the Anglosphere. Countries like Canada, the US, and the UK, declines among younger people in particular. And so when you look at these results, like, what stands out to you? And what do you think, they're capturing about people's lives?
Yeah. So, the annual publication of the World Happiness Report is always much anticipated by people like me who study well-being around the world. So, always an interesting document, despite its limitations, which is sort of built into any research enterprise. It's always bedeviled by the vices of its virtues. But yeah, it's an amazing document, principally for its coverage. I mean, it has the editors of the World Happiness Report are a team principally of economists, based mostly in the UK. Although the lead editor, John Helliwell, is actually in Canada,
Mm-hmm.
in British Columbia, and they leverage data from the Gallup World Poll, uh, with coverage of about 140 countries, to compare well-being, in just an absolutely enormous global perspective. So, you know, the report itself, it's kind of interesting. I mean, the rankings really don't, they publish this sort of global ranking every year, which is what's
Mhm.
the so-called happiest country based on its average score on this question about your life as a whole. And the rankings themselves don't often change all that much. I mean,
Mhm.
Finland is pretty much always number one. The Scandinavian countries are always in the top, five or six, that sort of thing. But this year, their focus in each report does change somewhat year to year in terms of like their sort of way into this question about what is happening with well-being globally. And this year, they've elected to focus on social media use and digital technologies, and particularly their impact on young people. And yeah, the big story there, and this is, I mean, obviously I'm not an author or editor of this document, so I have uh, perused it, as is my custom when it comes out, with interest every year. And the big takeaway this year seems to be, that there has been a marked decline in self-reported life evaluation and life satisfaction among young people, especially in the Anglosphere, over the last 15 years, I think is sort of the horizon they're looking at. And that does seem to be, and they leverage data not from the Gallup World Poll, but a kind of additional data set from the produced by the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. OECD runs a major international testing program every year called PISA. It's I always forget what PISA stands for, but it's a test that's
They do
administered
test scores as
internationally.
well. Yeah.
That is, yeah, that's used as a kind of gold standard for benchmarking national education systems, and it's
Hmm.
a way of kind of assessing how well education systems are doing. And so they have data from within the PISA assessment regime on social media use in 47 countries, including these Anglosphere countries. And that data, they draw on that data in several of the chapters to make the case that there's quite a strong association in their data between especially high rates of social media use and diminished life satisfaction or life evaluation,
Hmm.
which is consistent with the um, consistent with previous work by Jonathan Haidt, say, and Jean Twenge. John Haidt and his research director Zach Roush are actually co-authors of several chapters of this latest iteration of the World Happiness Report, and sort of are weighing in from their perspective on um, the variety of ways in which especially heavy social media use and the use of digital tech. It's really, we talk about it as social media use, but this is really,
Yeah.
that's kind of a shorthand for heavy use of especially smartphones or tablets that are loaded with a suite of particularly addictive. I mean, addictive is maybe a strong word, but
Yeah.
particularly habit forming, let's say, apps. So these include things like Instagram, or TikTok or YouTube as well for certain demographics, um, that are really designed to capture attention and retain attention, and do so with great efficacy among young people in particular. And yeah, so all of that, I think, I mean, that to my mind is quite consistent with um, the best evidence, as far as I can tell, about this question, going back a decade probably at this point. And I
Hmm.
do think the case is becoming quite overwhelming, that especially high rates of use, where high rates is 4 or 5 plus hours a day. Um, these technologies really do, they encourage um, uh, pretty unhelpful forms of social interaction that are really
Hmm.
driven by social comparison, envy, things like that. And they crowd out more life-giving, more helpful forms of social
Hmm.
interaction in flesh and
Yeah.
blood, out in the open air, right? That sort of thing. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. In addition to that, that rather significant factor. What are some of the other trends we're seeing, around the world that are notable, and again, in particular, in the Anglosphere countries? I mean, I think of Canada, and well, in some of these other countries,
Mhm.
Canada economic opportunity has declined considerably, and we also have lower social trust. I think it's the flip side of that coin of higher social media and technology use means more loneliness and isolation and less community time. Is there anything else you would say about the latest trends and what the factors are?
Yeah, I mean, one plausible and commonly cited difference between the Anglosphere broadly speaking, where this means, the UK, Canada, sort of all the Commonwealth countries plus the US, basically,
Yeah.
and other developed countries, particularly in Western Europe, is the uh, the relatively greater extent to which the economic and broader life prospects have sort of been eroded, especially for younger people in those countries, compared to a place like Germany, say, which has not seen the same degree of deindustrialization, certainly as the US or the UK.
Mm.
So, I think that since the 1970s, let's say, in the US in particular, and this also happened in roughly the same period in the UK. Um, there's been a major shift in the labor market um, away from jobs which in the 30 years or so, say after World War II, provided a pathway into a stable sort of middle class life for many, especially men who didn't go to college. This was sort of the normal thing. Like, you could go work at a steel mill, for instance. This is kind of the stereotype, but you could get a unionized job at a steel mill. It's maybe the same place your dad worked. And that was like a great job, actually. You could, support a family on it. You could buy a house in your town. And those jobs, that sort of like heavy industrial type of work has really receded from the labor market in the U.S. and the U.K. And I mean, actually, I'm less informed, honestly, about the picture in Canada, so I won't even weigh in there.
Yeah.
But so this has certainly been an issue, I think, and that has, there's a variety of factors that account for that. Some of that is trade and industrial policy. Some of that is, allowing companies to engage in labor arbitrage, moving jobs overseas. Some of that is probably down to automation, things
Hmm.
like that. So anyway, it's a complicated picture, but certainly it's
Yeah.
the case that America and the UK have been hit by those factors to a much greater extent than a place like Germany, say, or France, or I mean, much of the rest of Western Europe. So yeah, so that's, I think, part of the story, probably, about the difference in outcomes over the last 15 or 20 years or so. For why 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 is the Anglosphere feeling the sort of decline in well-being more sharply among young people? Social media is a big part of the story, but I do think some of these life and labor prospect uh, factors are also important.
Okay. So I want to get a little bit deeper into the methodological stuff here, just so as to pave the way for discussion of the global flourishing study and what it attempts to do, and try to
Yeah.
move beyond some of the limitations of these static measures. So GDP per capita, the Human Development Index, the happiness study that we've just been talking about. I tend to think of them as static snapshots in time. You can certainly get a sense of a trend, but they don't follow unique individuals. The happiness report from the UN. It focuses on this Cantrell ladder of subjective life evaluation. So it perhaps doesn't address certain goods. I'd just like to get a sense from you. What would you say about the most common measures that are used, some of which I've cited,
Yeah.
and what they capture and what they leave out?
Right. Yeah. I mean, for a long time, and this is still certainly true today in many policy related discussions, the single most important indicator of success in policy terms has been GDP per capita. Maybe, increasingly supplemented by some measures, say of income equality, Gini indexes, or things like that. But yeah, so enormous focus on economic growth for its own sake, and with the there's a reasonable intuition here, obviously, which is that in general, being able to feed and house yourself and those you love is a pretty important step on the way to having a good life. And if there's more income to go around, it's more likely that people will be able to afford the those kind of necessary conditions, for having a flourishing life. So I think the first thing to say about GDP per capita is, again, I'll tell you in a minute why I think it's a very limited measure. But we shouldn't discount the fact that it does actually, living in. I don't want to be heard as romanticizing living in dire poverty, or uh, food insecurity or that sort of thing. I mean, these clearly matter to almost everyone. Being able to have decent housing, being able to feed your kids, having uh, public services that work reasonably well, right? I mean, all of
Hmm.
that clearly matters a lot. And GDP per capita is a pretty good proxy for all of those outcomes, right? And that's
Hmm.
why governments have homed in on it as at least an initial kind of course measure of how we're doing,
Hmm.
as a society. Now, that being said, it is an extremely coarse measure, even of material prosperity, and this is, I think, is something that's easy to overlook. Uh, GDP per capita only measures um, uh, financial exchange, right? So it measures economic activity that's monetized in some way, right? So um, whether the goods and services that are being exchanged in those within that economic activity actually promote material prosperity, whether they actually make our lives better in any way, or whether those are, so I mean, just for instance, if you sell your watch to me and I sell my watch to you, and we each exchange a $50 bill, um, GDP per capita has increased. GDP has just increased by $100.
Yeah.
I mean, has anyone become more prosperous as a result? I mean, maybe if I really like your watch and you really like mine, maybe we're better off in some sense. But
Yes.
so and this has it does have real world implications. It's a fascinating piece I read last fall by the economist Philip Pilkington in the journal American Affairs, who made this point in a really striking way, which I've been thinking about ever since. And he pointed out that I think it's over roughly the last 10 years or so, the I think it's fair to call it virtual prostitution website OnlyFans has gone from having essentially $0 in revenue to now it's billions. I don't know what its total market capitalization is, but it's a very, very large company now, very lucrative company. Over roughly the same period, the percentage of American men aged 18 to 30 who report never having not having sex at all in a given year has tripled. Um, and this is a correlation. I don't want to like leap to making causal descriptions, but it's not hard to see how those two trends are related, right? And it's not at all obvious that the increase in um, economic activity within the broad domain that I would describe as, and this is not my term, but limbic capitalism, sort of corporate enterprises that kind of prey on our um,
Yeah.
uh,
Gambling. Much can be
yeah,
said for gambling,
vulnerabilities,
sports
exactly. Yeah, right.
gambling, and that sort of
Exactly.
thing.
Yeah. So sports gambling, yeah. The sale of sex, broadly speaking, the sale of highly addictive substances. I mean, the best example of this really is uh, the massive overprescription of drugs like oxycodone and OxyContin.
Hmm.
Which contributed to hundreds of thousands of deaths in this country, in the U.S.
Hmm.
alone, over the last several decades. So all of that is reflected in rising GDP numbers. All of that economic activity is reflected in rising GDP numbers. It's not at all obvious that uh, that growth in GDP, that increase in economic activity, reflects any underlying material prosperity. Actually, our lives are being made worse in many respects, many obvious respects, by that activity. So, and on the other hand, so that's stuff that gets included in GDP that really shouldn't be there, that's not reflecting actual material prosperity. And on the other hand, tons of stuff that happens in your life and mine that does reflect genuine material prosperity or sort of increasing, well, even material welfare is not captured by GDP. If it doesn't enter into a, you know,
A
tax
transaction, yeah, basically.
taxable financial transaction, yeah, if you every time if you bake a pie for your neighbor, and you take that over, that probably increases the neighbor's welfare in all kinds of important ways, but it's not registered. And I mean, and the classic example of this, of what's left out, is childcare, for instance. If if someone else takes care of your kids in exchange for a monetary fee, that's reflected in GDP. Uh, if someone takes care of their own kids, and no money's changing hands, exactly the same process is unfolding, right? And maybe it's, and in many cases, this is a way of doing things that the families themselves prefer, but it's not. It doesn't show up. So the GDP bias is really confused in all kinds of ways, right? I mean, that is, and so I do think there's been a very helpful shift, and really goes back decades, to be honest.
Hmm.
To try to move beyond GDP to find a better sort of key indicator or set of indicators. I would say probably the leading contender today for kind of the post GDP metric is this idea of life evaluation, as
Hmm.
popularized by the World Happiness Report. And part of the logic, honestly, part of the reason the World Happiness Report editors are so all in on having one outcome measure to report, that's kind of the basis of their annual report, is the thought that we need something as simple as GDP, at least to interpret. We need one number. So the equivalent, of like, what's the national life evaluation, in Finland or the US or whatever, because it just makes it really easy for policymakers to compare across contexts. You don't have to think about trade-offs and weighting and all of that. So, and to a certain extent, that makes sense. I mean, I do think it's harder to get policymakers to think about a dashboard of a bunch of different outcomes, and the trade-offs among them. So yeah, and so I mean, that's been the theory, and the theory, it's been very helpful, I will say. I mean, I think the World Happiness Report editors are very serious about um, their work as a kind of genuine move beyond GDP, beyond a narrow fixation on economic growth. So they often emphasize, that there's only a rough correlation between national averages for life evaluation and GDP per capita. So the U.S., is leaps and bounds wealthier in GDP terms than Sweden, say, or Finland, but Finland, the Swedes and Finns have higher life evaluations than the U.S. does, right? So,
Hmm.
so to that extent, I think that they have genuinely helped in moving the conversation beyond just a narrow fixation on, like, how can we generate more income? How can we generate more economic activity? Um, that being said, uh, and I should say, I mean, we at the Human Flourishing Program are engaged, have been for about a year, I guess, in a kind of friendly debate, public debate with the editors of the World Happiness Report. Some of this has happened in, private meetings with them and correspondence, and also, sort of published exchanges about what approach to take. What is the optimal approach to assessing, well-being, and how should we sort of talk to the public about this, and so uh, our view at the Human Flourishing Program is that uh, a good life, well, the way we define it, sort of for our heuristic working definition of flourishing is the relative attainment of a state in which all aspects of a person's life are good, including the context in which that person lives. So all aspects is deliberately broad. Like, it's what it entails really is that no finite number of questions is going to exhaustively capture what a good life looks like for you or me, right? I mean, there's always going to be some aspect of my life that I'm, that any questionnaire is not perfectly capturing.
Hmm.
The I think it's fair to say the sort of strong considered view of the World Happiness Report editors, which they've articulated in many publications, is that well-being just is subjective satisfaction with your life, and
Mm.
everything else that we talk about is like different dimensions of other dimensions of well-being, they see as a potential determinant. of subjective life satisfaction. So
Uh,
health for them is not a constituent of flourishing. It's a determinant of subjective life satisfaction. So this seems, and I think that example of health, to my mind, brings to the surface why this position has to be wrong. I mean, physical health is a good in and of itself, because it fits the kind of being we are. We are not just as far as I know, not brains in a vat. We have bodies. We are animals. Part of what it is for us to have a good life is for our bodies to be working the way that they're designed to work, to be functioning properly. And we know of cases. These are all pathological cases, but there are non-trivial numbers of people for whom good physical health is not subjectively satisfying. This is how you diagnose anorexia nervosa, for instance. Is people are not happy. People with anorexia are not satisfied with being at a healthy weight. So I think that our view is that you really need to assess, if you want anything approaching an adequate assessment of well-being. You really need to be asking lots of questions, ideally. And then there's a further question, and this is maybe deeper in the weeds than most people need to go. But there's a further question about, if you're only going to ask one question, like if that's really all, for whatever reason, all you have room for, or there's just not scope to do a larger assessment, what question should you ask? Only because it's the question that's in the Gallup World Poll. The World Happiness Report has always been based on this Cantrell ladder question you mentioned, which asks people to imagine a ladder with 11 rungs. The top rung is the best possible life. The bottom rung is the worst possible life. Where is your life on that ladder? There are other ways of asking this kind of question. There's another very commonly used question that just asks people without the ladder framing: how satisfied are you with your life as a whole these days? They have most researchers, including the World Happiness Report folks, have traditionally treated those as basically equivalent. Like is asking this as essentially the same question. There's some pretty compelling evidence now, converging streams of evidence, both from the Global Flourishing Study and from qualitative work that our research team, which includes my colleague Tim Lomas, conducted, that those questions are actually not equivalent, and that the Cantrell ladder question in particular, the question about the best to worst possible life, elicits more thoughts on average. Well, I shouldn't say more than it. The dominant thoughts it elicits seem to be thoughts about status and money, basically.
mhm.
So the there is still arguably a kind of GDP per capita bias in the
Yeah,
question, which is reflected, we think, in the annual rankings that they
right.
produce. So
Well,
yeah,
no, I want to come back and get into the global flourishing study a bit deeper now, just to get clear on what it is and how you do it. But I see in the way you've described the differences here, the normative assumptions about what flourishing look like are quite different. And in the UN happiness approach, it's the subjective response is very much rooted in this kind of utilitarian. I'm an individual, and my subjective understanding of my happiness is what counts. And there's a lot of questions about how much choice you have and what you can get
right,
versus to my mind anyway, what you're trying to do, which is look at both objective features as well as the subjective inputs, and what sort of things like a network framing, and goods you attain that are again objectively related to things like
yeah,
health or more robust interpretations of satisfaction. But I want to come back to that. But Brendan, first, could you just explain what the key features and inputs are of the global flourishing study, and like what you're trying to do? You've already said a little bit about
yeah.
what you're building on and what you're trying to get to, but what is it providing that is currently not out there?
Sure. Yeah, so the Global Flourishing Study is a project that we at the Human Flourishing Program are undertaking together with the Institute for Studies of Religion at Baylor University, Gallup, which is doing all the data collection, and the Center for Open Science, which is sort of housing and cleaning the data. It's a very, very large, ambitious project, very generously funded by a number of philanthropies, including the three Templeton philanthropies and several others. And the basic idea, I mean, the basic design is quite straightforward, at least to describe. So the idea is to survey the same 208,000 people in 22 countries every year for 5 years on a large battery of questions, about 100 items related to many aspects of their lives. The survey is built, this 100-item survey is sort of built around the a short 12-item index of flourishing that we use in a lot of our empirical work, and this index has 2 items for each of 6 different dimensions of flourishing. So those are happiness and life satisfaction, which is sort of the what the World Happiness Report editors say is just what is the gross and scope of a good
Mm-hmm.
life. So happiness and life satisfaction, physical and mental health, um, meaning and purpose in life, character and virtue, relationship satisfaction, and then as a sixth uh, subsidiary domain, which we see not as intrinsically valuable in its own right, but as important for sustaining flourishing over time, financial and material security. And so the Global Flourishing Study has a bunch of questions about different aspects of subjective well-being, and has questions about meaning in life. It has questions about many questions, not just about individual relationships, but about respondents' sense of belonging in their community, in their neighborhood, in their city, in their country. Questions about social trust. We also have a bunch of questions about religious and spiritual identity and practice, in part because this is, we know that this is central to the understanding of a good life held by many people around the world still
Yeah.
today. And also because we know that religious participation is a very important pathway to flourishing in all of the domains I've
Mm-hmm.
mentioned in many places. So I say it's simple to describe. The trick is actually finding say the same 16,000 people in India every year, which is
Yeah.
why it's actually quite complicated and expensive. So this is now we've just gotten the third wave of data. This is already by quite a long shot the largest longitudinal study of well-being ever conducted. The Gallup World Poll, which the World Happiness Report uses, has a much broader country coverage, but with relatively small sample sizes in each country, and it's a different sample every year. So it's a
Yeah. They're
cross-sectional
not
sample,
following unique
not following the
individuals.
same
Yeah.
people every year, right? So this, yeah, so that data lets us do lots of interesting things, in terms of looking at how people's lives are changing over time. We have a number of questions actually about respondents' life experiences at age 12, which we've been able to use to construct what we call a retrospective baseline wave. So, based on your experience, on what you recall about your life at age 12, what factors at age 12 predict differences in the present. So that's a whole other thing, we can do. You can use those data actually to construct a kind of synthetic longitudinal data set for, how has religious service attendance been changing? Because people were at age 12 in all different years, in the survey. So going back, decades and decades. So there's lots of cool things you can do with those data. But the biggest value add, we think, to the kind of current well-being science landscape is it just massively widens the zoom. So we have the same Cantrell ladder life evaluation question that the World Happiness Report's based on. Our
But
results look
it's.
more or less like the World Happiness
Mm-hmm.
Reports. Sweden, which is our Scandinavian country, does very well. It's second only to Israel, which is also consistently in the top 10 of the World Happiness Report.
Mm-hmm.
But if you look instead not at life evaluation, but at meaning in life, say, I understand my purpose in life. Sweden is 19th out of 22 countries in the Global Flourishing Study.
They also
So
take a whack ton of antidepressants in the
yeah,
Scandinavian
sure, right.
countries.
Suicide rates are not great in Scandinavia. Yeah, exactly. So I mean, I think these are, and yeah, we think that this, so that on the assumption that no, even the least bad possible single item measure of a good life is only going to be a very coarse approximation of flourishing as a whole. We
Mm-hmm.
think it's really valuable to ask a bunch of questions, not just to ask one. And to
Yeah.
really let the kind of diversity across the global landscape rise to the surface, so you can see. I mean, I can tell you, maybe I'll pause, but I'm happy to tell you more about the
Yeah,
results if
no,
you.
I think it's where you're going to go, hopefully, anyway, which is that, it sounds like you're assuming that these different, focal points of evaluation are crucial to some sort of sense of objective flourishing, whereas other approaches may not. They may think that it's in fact just self-reports, or it's things like life expectancy and
Sure.
and growth and financial opportunities, what have you. I would suspect that's because there is independent individual level field specific evidence for this that you find in psychology and sociology and what have you, that in fact things like the quality of relationships, connection to the transcendent, meaning and purpose in life, are in fact more closely associated with a robust sense of health and well-being, which includes opportunity, physical health, psychological depth health, these sorts of things. Is that fair to say? Like, why did you choose these different domains compared to what others have?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so the that 5 or 6 domain, uh it's really a way of operationalizing. It's a way of making concrete this broad definition, state in which all life aspects of your life are good. Uh that was arrived at, or it's set out in a paper in the proceedings of the National Academy of the Sciences in the U.S. By our program director Tyler Vanderweel. He published this in 2017, so this is actually before my time at the program. But the logic, as he states it in that paper, the logic of that selection is not that this is in any way exhausts the candidates for intrinsic dimensions of a good life, but just that uh, there are uh, there are good reasons. These are to some extent uh, uh, articulable a priori. I mean, prior to, I mean, just on the basis of sort of introspection, think about your own life. Don't you find it
Mm-hmm.
plausible that like a good life includes a deep sense of meaning? I mean, a good life is one that's physically healthy, right? But also based on a kind of broad cross-cultural survey, almost everyone across time and space um, attribute some importance to these 5 aspects of life.
Mm-hmm.
Again, it's not that there are no exceptions. There are you do run into people who are true hermits who just don't care about having friends or whatever. But in general, almost everybody, cares about these 5 aspects of a good life, at least to some extent. And yes, we do. I mean, we do a variety of uh, empirical research in our program. The Global Flourishing Study is our single largest project at the moment, but a lot of the research we do leverages decades old epidemiological cohort studies. So longitudinal studies that have been following people for 40, 50 years, large numbers of people, 90,000 nurses, that sort of
Like
thing.
that Harvard happiness study that's very famous, right?
Yes, that one, I mean, that one is it's quite different than the data sets I'm describing in the sense that
Okay, didn't
that one
mean
is
to.
very small. The grant study is an amazing study. It's amazing mostly because it's incredibly long running. It's been going for like 85 years, I think
Yeah.
now, or something insane like that. And they've looked at they started with 300 people though. Not even 265, I think. Harvard undergraduates.
Mhm.
They did add a cohort of black men from the Boston area. Not surprisingly, the Harvard student body was overwhelmingly white in the 1930s when this was constructed. Um, but yeah, so the grant study is longitudinal in that sense. Yeah, but
But anyway, yeah,
what I'm
your
talking
epidemiological
yeah,
stuff. Yeah.
what I'm talking about is, yeah, like these are, so you ask the same 90,000 nurses are surveyed every couple of years about many aspects of their life, and their health outcomes are tracked too. So cardiovascular health, depressive incidents, mortality data is collected as well and reported. And yeah, so we use those kinds of data sets. There's a variety of them that we leverage with different age groups to look at, the effects on many aspects of flourishing, including health outcomes and even premature mortality, of things like attending religious services every week. Um, Deciding to get married is one interesting study that we conducted a few years ago. Um, Becoming more grateful. How do changes in gratitude, over time affect even. So we found, for instance, this is a paper published in 2024. I think my colleague Ying Chen found that uh, over, I think, a fairly short period. I believe it was only 4 or 5 years in this cohort of middle aged, now mostly middle aged nurses, that if you compare the people with the highest self-reported gratitude to the people with the lowest self-reported gratitude,
Hmm.
over time, higher gratitude was associated with, I think, a 10% reduction in premature mortality, which is pretty
Yeah.
remarkable. I mean, that's quite a strong effect. So yeah, so there's very clear evidence that these aspects, more let's say subjective aspects of uh, uh, of flourishing have or let's say behavioral
Yeah.
choices that might seem kind of irrelevant to health. I mean, the decision, most people don't think about the decision to go to church or synagogue as relevant to
Yes.
their health in the way
Physical
that like their
health.
diet or exercise is.
Yeah.
But it turns out, yeah, these all do. It all hangs together, and there's
Right.
very strong evidence, yeah, that those living in a kind of social and moral ecology of dense overlapping networks of loving relationships, really does very profoundly feed into many aspects of flourishing, not just happiness, but
Okay.
also health. And yeah,
Well, that's fascinating. Thanks for sharing a bit more of the research that you do at the Harvard Flourishing Program. And I guess I get the sense that both you're doing research to inform what are your understanding of what the contributing factors to a robust sense of flourishing are, and then that also informs the refinement of the questionnaire and the global flourishing study work. So
yeah. I
that's
mean, the Global Flourishing Study questionnaire, was it started out about twice as long as it ended up being, and
yeah,
then
you whittle it down.
Gallup sort of came back and said you absolutely cannot ask this many questions. So so it was definitely a process of killing your darlings. I think that sort
Yeah,
of
right.
idea, but yeah, and the thought was just to let's try to cover as much of the
As you can.
terrain as we can. Yeah.
Yeah, you don't want to lose one of those 16,000 though over in another part of the world with
Right.
the responses being too
If it's
long.
too
So that's
long, yeah, exactly
yeah.
right. So that's
So
Gallup's job, yeah, is to keep the response rate up. Yeah.
right. So what now I want to get into like what's the data telling you through the global flourishing study? I mean, the most recent wave, I think it was last year sometime. It was really notable from my assessment in that a lot of the countries that you would expect to be at the top through either the UN happiness or more typical human development or GDP scores, or developed countries, as they say, were not as near the top. It was it was countries who were kind of middle of the road, up and coming a little bit, but who also had much more robust religious participation, married and family life, networks of community, and these sorts of things. Also, climbing economically, that could be another factor. But I'd just love to get a sense from you on what the findings say and what the main takeaways are about what's most important for flourishing as you've conceived it.
Yeah. Yeah. So, partly because there's so much data, it's hard to tell like a simple, clean story about it, I think. And that's part of the virtue, I think, of the Global Flourishing Study. But yeah, one way into this is to take a look at, I mentioned we use this 12 item index of flourishing. It's got 12 questions essentially about six
Mhm.
broad aspects of your life, sort of at the heart of a lot of our empirical work. And so that those 12 questions are in the Global Flourishing Study questionnaire. And so if you zoom in on those, let's just think about those across these 22 countries in the first wave of data. Results didn't really change much, from year one to year two, which is encouraging, to be honest. It'd
Right.
be sort of alarming, if it you're seeing massive jumps in meaning, at the national level. There's a couple of exceptions I can mention, but yeah. So uh, if you average scores, if you average the national average scores for those 12 questions, you get a number that we call composite flourishing. It's just an average of the averages of those 12 questions. So it's not like a scale in a strong sense, like a psychological scale is designed to assess one thing, 12 questions to assess hope or something like that. It's not like that. It's just an average of these, but it gives you a kind of rough and ready sense of how things are going across these 12 aspects of life. And so if you average those, you can then rank order the countries in the study based on their scores, right? Average scores. And if you do that, yeah, when we did that, the results were very surprising. I will say, we're still kind of trying to wrap our heads around them, but particularly if you are coming to it with a perspective informed by the World Happiness Report, where you sort of expect Sweden, say, to, come top. Certainly in our set of countries, Sweden should have been number one, based on the World Happiness Report's life
Right.
evaluation data, or I guess two, based on its own life evaluation score in the Global Flourishing Study data. What we found instead was that the countries with that were sort of substantially above the mean, say, way above average in this group, were countries like Indonesia and the Philippines and Mexico. The only really high income country in the proper sense that was sort of in that above the mean group
Top
was
10 or
Israel.
something. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's sort of the way we sort of talk about it is that if you look at this composite flourishing rankings, let's say ordered means, between about number 9 and number 20 is almost like a tie. It's like a, whatever, 11-way tie or something like that. I mean, they're all about 7, sort of. They're a little above or a little below 7. That's interesting in itself, because that includes countries like Sweden and the US and Germany and Spain. It also includes countries like Nigeria and Kenya and Tanzania. Tanzania's GDP per capita is about $1,100 per year. The U.S. is about $82,000 per year. They have essentially the same composite flourishing score, which is wild. I mean, that is really, really surprising.
Hmm.
And then at the bottom end, there were a couple of countries that were really way below the mean. I mean, which had just noticeably lower scores across many, many outcomes.
Hmm.
And those they included the UK, which was 20th, Turkey, and Japan. Japan especially was very, very low, very, very low scores for many, many aspects of flourishing. And this is interesting. For me, it's become kind of emblematic, Indonesia and Japan, because if you look at the literature on economic development, for instance, these countries are often contrasted um, as sort of two routes, to development in the post-war period. Japan is always held up as the great success story. This is how you go from a basically agrarian economy, in 1868, when the Meiji Restoration starts, to, by the 1970s, like a kind of post-industrial high tech. They were the second largest economy in the world. They were going to eat everybody's lunch. That was sort of and Indonesia is the basket case. By comparison with Japan, Indonesia in this literature is sort of treated as the basket case. They're an example of the middle income trap. This is how you don't develop economically.
Hmm.
you know, um, so, but Indonesians are like way, way above the mean for many, many aspects of not just those 12 questions, but if you look at many, many aspects of a good life, showing love and care to others. Do you have someone you can count on?
Hmm.
Social trust. Actually, East Asians do very well for social trust, I will say, but
Hmm.
in the GFS. But um, and some of this, the comparisons are not straightforward. And I think it's important. I always, want to emphasize when I mention this kind of, ranking of composite flourishing, that it's really not at all clear what that means and how straightforward comparisons among these countries are. So the survey was administered in about 44 languages across these countries. That there's huge opportunity for variation and understanding of the questions based on different small differences in translation. They were administered in different time points across that, roughly 9-month span that data collection was underway. Just because it takes a long time. Um, there's some evidence that East Asian respondents actually prefer the middle of 10-point scales. Like they see it as kind of boastful or bad to pick a 9, say, or whatever. So that might be dragging down the Japanese mean a little bit, although it doesn't seem to have done that nearly as much in China, for instance, which is also in the study. So we do find, even if you ask, we know that's not the whole story, because even when they're asked yes or no questions, like, do you have someone you're close to that you can count on, where it's just, yes or no, so that effect of the scale can't possibly be a factor. The Japanese are still by far the lowest in terms of agreeing that they have someone they can count on. So, what the story, I would say, in broadest terms, that's kind of emerged for us. One of the most important takeaways from our initial work on the Global Flourishing Study is that there seems to be a pretty pronounced divide globally between, as you mentioned, the sort of developed economies where life evaluation in this Cantrell ladder sense is relatively high, and where financial and material security, say, are high, um, and where we see a variety of undeniably important objective outcomes like quality of life, adjusted life expectancy, or I mean, it's no question those are all, we're doing better. Japan is
Hmm.
doing much better than Indonesia in that respect, right? I mean,
Hmm.
Japan has among the highest life expectancy in the world. So uh, those places, though, despite the sort of objective success in many respects in attaining the kind of foundations of a good life, are just
Hmm.
lower in self-reported meaning in life, self-reported pro-social character traits, like promoting the good or showing love and care to others, and in relationship satisfaction. And those differences are pronounced enough that they're actually dragging down the sort of overall composite flourishing mean, so
Yeah.
that they're, the Indonesian, so-called Indonesian advantage, in those areas, is lifting it up, even above Sweden. Say Sweden is, like, I think, even including financial and material security in that 12 item index,
Hmm.
Sweden's composite flourishing mean puts it at like 13th out of 22. So
Yeah.
yeah, that's interesting. I think we think that, again, it's not, what you do with that is not straightforward, and it probably
Well,
varies a
that's,
little bit by context. I mean,
yeah,
so
certainly.
its implications for people in the U.S., say, are different than its implications probably for people in Indonesia.
Sure.
But I think we need to take that seriously. But there's a real
No.
opportunity here for self-reflection, we think.
Yeah, no, undoubtedly, and I want to get to the policy implications insofar as you feel, inclined to extrapolate beyond the,
Yeah,
the confines of your study.
sure.
Um, but before I do, I just want to get probe deeper on why you think some of these differences exist, and I'll just give you my hypothesis is that, when we look at the difference between some of these countries that are scoring lower yet higher on some of the necessary foundations, as you say, it's that we find really significant differences in terms of levels of individualism versus more community
Yeah.
oriented places, secularization and religious participation, that individual communitarian dimension strongly affects the level of social capital, the time we put into family and developing community relationships, marriage rates and family formation closely linked to those things as
Right.
well. And so when you with that in mind, is it perhaps not so surprising that you see where those things are stronger, as opposed to Anglosphere and some of the highly developed countries where they may be lower, that you're seeing the results you are.
Yeah. Yeah. Everything you've just mentioned, I think, is a plausible. It's clearly a correlate of composite flourishing in the global flourishing study.
Mhm.
At wave one, we obviously need to be careful about making causal descriptions.
Sure.
We are looking at wave two at the effects, say, of religious service attendance, or other aspects of religious identity on subsequent changes in flourishing. Those effects are pretty modest year to year, because, again, these things just don't tend to change all that much for most people. At least, on average, they don't change all that much, for most people over the course of a year. But yeah, so certainly, if you look at, just, again, that kind of composite flourishing rankings, or ordered means, um, in Indonesia, which has the highest composite flourishing, about 75% of the sample says they attend religious services every week. Um, in Japan, which has the lowest composite flourishing mean, only, I think, 3% say they attend religious services every week. And actually, Japan, it's interesting. You mentioned individualism. This is probably worth flagging at this point, that I think some listeners might be sort of saying, like, aha, but Japan is a collectivist country. It's East Asian. They're not individualists. There's ongoing debates about what individualism is, or if is it a family of traits. How is it distributed around the world? But my own view, and this is supported by some recent work. I think the best recent index of individualism, and sort of assessing it globally, to my mind, argue specifically, there's an appendix in this paper arguing that Japan is actually, by any reasonable measure, a highly individualist country. Conventional measures of individualism include things like how many cars on average, how many cars are being driven in a country. That's an indicator of sort of less dense communal ties. Religiosity is a very important indicator of individualism. Hours worked is one. I mean, there's by all kinds of measures, Japan is a highly individualist country, and is indisputably a very, very, very secular country. Every way we have of measuring religious identity and participation in Japan ranks last out of the sample. So it's possible that there's some aspect. I mean, we have a bunch of questions about this. It's possible we're missing something, but I don't think so. I think it is just genuinely a very secular place. And one thing that I would highlight. I mean, this is, I think, a factor that's easy to overlook. But if you look at the two countries that are doing the worst, I mean, worst here is, again, let's just say, to a first approximation, the countries that seem to have the most challenges in the global flourishing study, they're Japan and Turkey. Japan and Turkey, on their face, don't have much in common, like culturally speaking, right? They're nowhere near each other. One is majority Muslim, one is sort of historically Shinto and Buddhist. But one factor they do have in common, and I know I'm just admittedly speculating. This is an N of two, but one thing they do have in common is very, very rapid and traumatic processes of economic and cultural modernization in the late 19th and 20th centuries, both involving losses in world wars. I mean, massive after World War I, the formation of the Republic of Turkey involved enormous, like, sweeping cultural changes overnight. They switched from the Arabic script to Latin script. Wearing headscarves was banned. Turkey became a kind of officially secular society in almost a laicist, French way, kind of overnight. They've backslidden from that in a lot of in pretty profound ways since then. But and in Japan too, similarly, it was just the beginning with the Meiji Restoration in the late 1860s. Process of cultural transformation was extremely rapid and quite racking. So anyway, I mean, I think there's more to say about this, but to my mind, one key variable might be the pace of cultural and economic change as much as the direction. So which, again, I think potentially has real relevance for current debates about what the IDF or the IMF, sorry, or World Bank or whatever should be prioritizing for the Philippines or Indonesia or whatever. But yeah.
No, but it's interesting, as you say, that all of those things that I mentioned, individualism versus community orientation, levels of isolation versus social participation, levels of social capital, religious participation, family life. These are all strongly associated with flourishing, and they're waning a bit here in Canada and the United States.
Certainly, yeah.
We won't. In talking about policy implications for this, I mean, you're not studying. It's not. You can't just translate, a finding about these reports to some policy direction in a given field. But I think it's very clear that policymakers rely upon indices of various sorts like these. There's a pretty close connection, if not direct. And so I wonder, at that level, Brendan, like, what do you see as some of the implications for your work? I know you are working with some state level and probably international entities about this. What do you see on the horizon?
Yeah, we are involved, in a consultative fashion, I would say, with a number of projects at the state level in the U.S., states of Tennessee and Arkansas in particular. We've consulted with various groups at the White House. We're partnering with a group actually at the UN and their the UN Habitat, so it's called, as an office that's concerned with subnational entities. So how do you sort of localize the SDGs? And they're developing an initiative they call Everyone Can Flourish, which was actually originally kind of developed in a small autonomous region of Finland called Åland. It's a Swedish-speaking region of Finland, and so we've been working with them to essentially articulate a vision, for taking that model global. They've actually been using Åland has been using our flourishing index for about a
Mm,
decade. In their own policy work, like actually collecting, data across the region,
interesting.
uh, on these indices and using them as kind of soft benchmarks, at least for as the outcome of public policy. Yeah,
Hmm.
I think the first thing I would say about this, I mean, I have lots of thoughts about this, which I should offer with the qualification that I'm not a policy analyst, or a political scientist or whatever. So, I mean, I think these are judgments that are informed, by my and my colleagues' work on the distribution and determinants of a good life.
Hmm.
But ought to be leavened certainly by conversation with people who are really adept in framing policy, and active writing legislation. Implementing it is not straightforward, of
Hmm.
course. So, but to my mind, the first thing really to say about this is that we should be much more explicit, as a society, as societies, about the actual goal of public policy. Um, De facto, I think the goal of most public policy in the U.S. and really across the developed world, really probably everywhere that's living under a sort of IMF, World Economic Forum, World Bank kind of mandate, is economic growth. That is sort of the at the end of the day, still, I think that's sort of the tail that's wagging the dog, in the U.S. And it would be huge. I think it would have major implications, even just in terms of spillover effects, for the federal government to say clearly and explicitly, we believe that the proper end of all public policy is flourishing. Or, I mean, the U.S. Constitution talks about promoting the general welfare, right? This is language that
Hmm.
I'm very happy to see taken up in a fuller way. That we don't
Mm.
think that's reducible just to material prosperity. We think that economic growth is only as good as the meaning and friendships and character that it builds for us, and that to the extent that it diminishes those aspects of our life, it's bad for us. Actually, that we
Yeah.
that's a bad trade. Um, and that might involve that commitment could involve at minimum, say directing the U.S. Census Bureau to collect nationally representative data on an annual
Right.
basis on a much wider range of well-being indicators than we currently do.
Hmm.
So this would, those kinds of things, to my mind, are sort of low-hanging fruit. And that the reality is, that we often say in the program that you treasure what you measure. I mean, this is we have a benchmark to work towards, right? GDP per capita is something we're measuring all the time, and
Yeah.
so
That's all you see.
that's all you see, right? Exactly. So if we could and I think that's the logic, as we've discussed previously, of the World Happiness Report too, is to give
Yeah. Move
countries
beyond it.
another number to chase. We think that would not be my choice of the indicator, but that kind of thing is urgent and essential, I think. Now, at a more ambitiously, and you're thinking now about these kind of like core institutional pathways. You've mentioned. I mean, our uh, we do a lot of work, as I've mentioned, on religious communities and marriage and family in particular. Um, those are arguably our species' two oldest institutions. Every society, pretty much in the anthropological record, has some version of both of those. What that looks like varies, obviously, across time and place, but that's probably not an accident. That's probably because those institutions are fitted in a pretty deep way to the kind of thing we are. That it's I mean, for marriage in particular, it makes sense that we have our kids are born pretty half baked, and they take a really long time to get to be
Yeah.
ready, to so it really does humans have been pair bonding, to bring moms and dads together to raise their kids longer than there have been Homo sapiens, probably. This goes way back in our
Hmm.
species lineage. So the increasing fragility of those institutions in particular across the developed world is huge cause for concern.
Yeah.
I mean, marriage and family in particular is the sort of leading indicator here. I think is rapidly declining fertility. Of course, on a long enough timeline, if you don't have any people, you don't really need to solve any other policy problems. All of those problems just solve themselves. I mean, like, you don't have to worry about where the social security checks are coming from if we don't have citizens, to receive them. So yeah, I think that's a real cause for concern. I mean, we just, as another illustration of this, our program's work on religious service attendance um, indicates that in the United States, about 40% of the increase in suicide from, I think it was 2000 to 2015, which was an enormous increase, of hundreds of thousands of suicides. About 40% of that increase was at least partly attributable to declining rates of religious service attendance.
Mm.
Which is not to say partly attributable means this was one link in the chain,
Yeah. Social
right?
media
For
use, other
most,
things. Yeah.
yeah, drug
A lot of
abuse,
things.
right? That kind of things. But this was an opportunity, a missed opportunity for hundreds of thousands of people to get off that pathway to suicide,
Right.
which they
Yeah.
miss, right? So it has real public health implications. So I think,
Yeah.
to my mind, very urgent, another set of very urgent but just really difficult questions that policymakers across the developed world should be thinking about more than they seem to be is, uh, are there ways to revive these institutions? Are there ways to persuade people to get married or get married sooner, than they? I mean, because it's a enormously impactful institution on average. And it's worth saying, I haven't said this, and I always try to say this in these contexts, that when I'm talking about, the average benefits of, the average effects on life expectancy of attending religious services or getting married, um, what's true on average for most people is not true for tons and tons of people, right? So there are lots of people who get married, obviously, for whom that turns out to have been a terrible decision, and it makes their life worse. Plenty of people who go to church every week or synagogue every week or mosque, whose
Yeah.
lives are who are more depressed or lonelier because of it, right? So it's not,
Yeah.
but at this, thinking in policy terms, we're thinking about what's true on average across the population as a whole. And
Yeah.
yeah, this does seem to me like there's a fairly clear public health case, really, for
Yeah.
the importance of investing in reviving these institutions. Now, this is complicated in the U.S., of course. There are constitutional limitations on what the federal government can do. So, again, with allowances for the complications there, anyone who's talking about, the importance of social connection, for instance, or the crisis of loneliness, but not talking about declining marriage rates and declining religious service attendance, is just not a serious person in my mind. I mean, this is to
Yeah.
put it really to put it really
Yeah.
bluntly.
Well, no,
Um,
these two main takeaways I'm drawing from your last remarks here. Yes, you treasure what you measure, and vice versa. And where your treasure is, there your heart will also
right.
be. And
Yep.
focusing too much on GDP and GDP per capita, to the exclusion of all of these other very clear, important determinations of robust flourishing. Shifting towards the latter would be, very salutary development for public
Sure.
policy, and I think have a cascading effect. And as you say, there are clear lessons that you can draw from the important determinants, and if we start measuring them, we'll be able to, I think, tailor interventions appropriately, such that they are
Yep.
realized for more people. So, Brendan, this has been a fascinating and wide ranging conversation. Thank you for joining us. And to our listeners,
Sure.
if you enjoyed this episode, please like and subscribe. Please check out Brendan's work at the Harvard Flourishing Program, and look out for Wave 3, which lo
Yeah.
and behold has just arrived, apparently in his inbox, and so much more to discover in the coming years. They're really at just the infancy of this great program. So, for the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, I'm Peter Copeland. Thank you for joining us on Inside Policy Talks.